And welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adam Luke and I head up the School Attendance Policy and Strategy team here at the Department of Education. And I'm joined this afternoon by my colleague Paul Baker. And together between us, we're going to provide an overview of the working together to improve school attendance guidance ahead of it becoming statutory from the beginning of the new school year. Before we get started, a huge thank you to everybody for joining us this afternoon, but also a huge thank you to everyone for all of the efforts that you continue to make on attendance. I know sometimes it feels like a slow, frustrating task, but the collective efforts of school staff, local authority teams, and indeed parents and pupils up and down the country is really starting to pay off. Since we last did this session when the first version of the guidance came out in 2022, there are already 440,000 fewer persistent absentees than there were then. And new data that we published on Friday, just gone, showed 375,000 more pupils in school almost every day, those with more than 95% attendance compared to this point last year. And that trend holds across regions, with the exception of Inner London, across all of the regions, and for vulnerable groups and across school types. Next slide, please. Perfect. So we'll start this afternoon with Paul giving a bit of a brief introduction of the changes that have been made between the original version in 2022 and the new version published on the 29th of February this year. If you haven't seen it yet, we'll make sure there's a link in the chat. You haven't missed out yet. It doesn't come into force till the beginning of the new school year, but we publish it with a terms notice so that people had time to read through, reflect and make any changes. The headline there is there are some important changes in there, but if you have been working hard to put the 2022 version into place, you'll be well ahead of the curve for 2024 because the changes, whilst important, are minimal. Then after Paul's done that, between us we'll run through the expectations that are set out in chapter 2. That they are very similar to the 2022 version, so many of you will be very familiar with those expectations and none of it should come as a shock. It'll act as a bit of a refresher, but we've got lots of colleagues joining and watching along today who are new to attendance or who've picked up the senior attendance champion role, or haven't seen the guidance before, so we're going to work through them quite slowly and step by step, to cover the variety of people that we've got on the call. We'll then touch very briefly on the chapter 4 of the guidance, the role of the local authority and what you can expect from local authorities and other partners. Again, that should be familiar to many of you, but so a bit of a refresher, but we'll go through it and through the basics so that anyone who's new will hear it for the first time. And at the end, we'll have some time for questions. If you've got a question, try and pop that into the question bar on the side of the screen. We're a big group this afternoon, so it's unlikely we'll get through everyone's questions, but Paul and I will try and sort of collect them up and answer the key themes from people and get through as many of those as we can. Great, let's get started then. Next slide, please. And over to you, Paul.
Great, thanks, Adam. We're going to have an overview of the changes that we've made now to work together to improve school attendance. So next slide, please. So I think the first thing I'd like to say here actually is that the new guidance was part of a wider package of attendance reforms. They were all announced on leap year day, so on February the 29th, and mostly come into effect ahead of the next school year. And these are reforms that are designed to support the sector. They're all built on the strategy that was already in place and the great work that all of you are already doing. And we do think that's the right strategy. So Adam's already mentioned the large numbers of pupils who are in school, an increased number of days last year, which is absolutely brilliant. It's also worth noting that the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development highlighted our comprehensive strategy for recognition in their recent report. So while there are clearly significant ongoing challenges in relation to attendance, which we would never want to underestimate, but it does feel like collectively we're going about the right track to address them. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go through every item on this slide in detail, as it's not the focus of today's session, and actually a lot of them are covered in some of the other webinars we're doing over this term. But I do think it's useful to see that the guidance is part of a bigger picture. And in fact, in many ways, the guidance is the overarching document which brings that bigger picture together. So, for example, the guidance is a document which explains some of the regulations on attendance data sharing. It explains what the new attendance and admission registers means for you, and it explains how you and the local authority can work together to implement that new national framework for penalty notices. So it brings all of that together. Next slide, please. Great. So many of you will know that actually working together to improve school attendance has actually already been in existence for around 2 years. So it was introduced in 2022 following the school's white paper as a non-statutory piece of guidance. Actually, we know that the majority of schools and the majority of local authorities are already implementing the key elements of it. And one thing I'd really like to emphasize here is that it's based on existing best practice. So actually the new attendance ambassador, Rob Tarn, mentioned recently that he felt that the answers to the attendance problem were already within the sector, and the guidance is based on the same principle. So it's based on the best practice that schools and local authorities who had high levels of attendance, but also higher than average levels of disadvantage. It's based on what they were already doing. I've sought to bring that together and kind of present back in this guidance. And what the department found when bringing that best practice together, you won't be surprised at all to know, is that the best practice was based on a support-first approach. So many of the schools who were really tackling attendance well were doing so by listening to pupils and their parents, by identifying the barriers that were stopping them coming to school, and by putting support in place to remove those barriers. And it was only where needed that the schools would go on from voluntary support to formalising that support. And again, it was only where needed where they would move on from formalised support to enforcement and legal action. Great. And then if you could just bring up the next box on that slide. So the reason we're here today, really, I guess, is that we've published a new version of the guidance, which comes into effect in time for the new academic year, the new school year. And I'd really like to emphasise here that this is a continuum rather than completely new guidance. The changes that we've made have followed on from stakeholder feedback and consultation, and they continue to be based on best practice. And we think they are really important changes, but they're not massive changes. We're not starting again by any means. We're continuing with what we've already started. So the new guidance is statutory. So that means that schools, trusts, governing bodies and local authorities must have regard to it from the new school year as part of their efforts to maintain high levels of school attendance. Some of the other changes are listed on the right of your screens. So the guidance does bring out increased clarity on the link between attendance and wider school culture. So part of that feeling of how creating that sense of belonging can really help pupils and parents in terms of attendance. I've mentioned the changes to the attendance and admissions registers, and I've mentioned the new national framework for penalty notices. The last change that you can see on the right is that we've changed the name from parenting contracts to attendance contracts. So they still do exactly the same thing, but it's just the name's changed. And actually, one or two areas were already doing this and found that it had been really effective in increasing uptake, particularly amongst parents, as they just felt that the name better reflected the nature of the agreement between them and the school or local authority. Great. Next slide, please. So I've run through the kind of overall changes we've made to the guidance. We've also made some changes to the expectations both for schools and local authorities. Again, I'd really like to emphasise at this point that this is a continuum rather than new guidance. So if you've invested time in implementing that existing version of the guidance, then that's brilliant. They won't have gone to waste at all. And actually, these new changes won't lead to a lot of new work for you. But we have included an updated section on physical and mental ill health. So, for example, to give a bit more clarity on where the school's role starts and finishes. We know that this is a barrier that a lot of pupils face in terms of their attendance. So actually, we hope that this will give you a bit more clarity and will be helpful to you in that regard. Adam's going to talk about that section a bit more later. We've also clarified the expectations of the senior attendance champion. We actually delivered a webinar on this last week. So if that is your role, if you're on the senior leadership team at the school and the champion for attendance, then do have a look at that when it comes on the YouTube channel. And I've mentioned the new expectations on data sharing. The final expectation, the final change on this list, again, is a relatively small but important one. So we already expected that where schools knew that a child had a social worker, they should inform them of any unexplained absences. We've now added the expectation that where you know that the pupil has a youth offending team worker, that you also inform them of the same. And that's based on best practice and in the interest of the pupil. And if we could bring up perfect, the next box. So as I said, we've also updated the expectations of local authorities. I won't focus on these in detail here, as it's not the focus of today, but we will talk at the end briefly about what you can expect from your local authority. And we have, just to go over it in a bit of detail, we have provided a bit more detail on what local authorities should be providing to you as part of their core offer, and then what they can also offer to you as additional traded services, if that would be of benefit to you. We've also sought to provide a bit more detail on how responsibilities should be shared if a pupil lives in one local authority and goes to school in another, for example. So that's a very quick overview of the changes we've made as a whole. As Adam said at the start, we're now going to go in a bit more detail through each of the expectations of schools in Chapter 2 of the guidance. So if we could have next slide, please, and I'll hand back over to Adam and bring him on screen.
Thanks very much, Paul. Yeah, let's zoom out. Next slide, please. Perfect. So the first expectation is schools set out in the guidance, and this is all in Chapter 2, if you want to go back and look at the detail, is around building strong relationships and working jointly with families. Now, that sounds like common sense, but we see time and time again in the most effective schools on attendance that becomes their general approach. So not being rigid, but listening to and understanding the barriers to attendance and working in partnership with families and those pupils to remove them. Paragraphs 18 to 24 of the guidance set it out in detail, but where a pattern of absence is at risk of becoming, or perhaps indeed becomes problematic, schools can draw on those relationships that they've been building to listen to the problems, understand the barriers that their family are facing, and work with the family to put the right support in place. And that includes involving the pupil in that if they're old enough, in coming up with the solutions alongside school and parents. In the more complex cases, where those barriers are often outside of the school's control, housing, transport, etc., schools are expected to still have those conversations and to agree the actions, but it's more about encouraging engagement with the relevant support services, signposting and helping families to access those right support services. And that includes obviously working alongside the local authority when the absence intensifies and the additional types of support that they can provide is needed. That may be the school acting as part of a team around the family or conducting an early help assessment. It may mean working with the local authority to ensure the right medical needs support in place. And of course, where that voluntary support has not been effective, working alongside the local authority to formalise the support, either through an attendance contract, as Paul has mentioned, or through taking legal action. And two big questions come up really on this expectation when I'm out and about. Firstly, what happens if there's long waiting lists for that particular type of support? And secondly, what happens if we've tried everything and nobody's around to help us? So on the first, if there's a waiting list for a particular type of support, again, it sounds obvious, but there may be things that can be done in the meantime. There may be tweaks and changes that can be put in place, not to fix the problem or to remove the barrier fully, but to mitigate that absence and engage the pupil in as much learning as they can whilst you wait for that support to be put in place. And if you're struggling with that, your local authority attendance support team, whilst they can't do everything for you, may be able to help and provide advice and support on where to go, or of other things that are available in the area that you may not be aware of, or share practice from other schools in the area that have made those tweaks and adjustments in processes that have led to the sort of improvement temporarily whilst people are on that waiting list. And then on the second, if a particular form of support, the one people often mention that has a long waiting list is CAMHS, obviously. If a particular form of support is refused by the family or it doesn't work in the first instance, that doesn't mean it won't work if you try again. If a family refuses to have an early help assessment, it doesn't mean that you can't continue to engage with them and support them in some of the ways that that early help assessment would have led to. And then through the sort of perseverance, the best schools on attendance start to see that relationship with the family improve and people feel that they can engage in the support. So I suppose the guidance is clear that in those cases, partners are expected to work with the school to provide the right opportunities. Where those right opportunities aren't available immediately or they're not taken up immediately, try other things. And if you've gone through everything and feel you've gone through everything, sometimes coming back to the start of that and thinking about the same things again is the best and most appropriate action. And ultimately, of course, if parents refuse all types of support, there is the legal route where support hasn't worked. I think I'm coming back to you now, Paul. Thanks.
Excellent. Next slide, please. So the second expectation is around developing and maintaining a whole school culture that promotes the benefits of high attendance. And this really reflects the idea that good attendance is a learned behaviour. So the schools that are able to develop that positive culture and embed it in their vision and in their day-to-day life are the ones who can really instill good patterns from the outset. Of course, the factors which influence an individual pupil's attendance can be many and varied. So it's actually developing the strategy will often involve weaving attendance into strategies in other areas, such as attainment, behaviour, bullying, SEND, well-being, use of pupil premium, and I'm sure others. Going down onto the third point on the list, schools are expected to have a dedicated member of the senior leadership team who has overall responsibility for really setting that tone and vision for attendance and having oversight for ensuring it's followed through. And again, we delivered a webinar on that last week, which will be on the YouTube channel shortly. But it's not just the senior attendance champion. Attendance is, of course, everyone's business. And actually, for individual pupils, the members of teaching and non-teaching staff who interact with them will be different for each one. So it is really important that everybody understands the importance of good attendance. They understand the school's strategy on it, and they also receive any training and professional development they need. Zooming them back out a bit from, or zooming back in a bit from all staff, sorry, maintaining that culture around attendance is also going to mean ensuring that attendance support is appropriately resourced in terms of specific members of staff's responsibilities. And this will look very different for different kinds of schools, but we do say in the guidance that where possible, this should include attendance or pastoral support staff. So there could be school-based or there could be contracted, but there's members of staff who can really work in partnership with families to support on attendance. And for some schools here, again, depending on the setting, but it may be applicable to think about whether the use of pupil premium funding could be appropriate here. Moving down the list, it's important that pupils are set high standards for attendance and punctuality, and that this is communicated regularly and clearly. But ideally, this will be accompanied by communicating why attendance is important, so that parents and pupils understand the positive impact it has on their attainment, well-being, and development, and they can really understand why those expectations are being set. So lots of schools do this throughout school life, for example, via displays, assemblies, or in registration periods. And where it can be done sensitively, this can also include praising and rewarding attendance, whether that be individually or collectively, maybe at class or year group level. And from an inclusivity point of view, it is worth thinking about not just rewarding high attendance, but also rewarding improved attendance. Of course, moving on to the penultimate point, attendance is never solved, if only it were. So actually, the best schools, as part of their culture and attendance, are really good at reviewing what they've done, kind of updating their strategies and updating their communications, identifying what worked really well and maybe what they might need to look at again. And then the last point on culture, which I'm sure you will recognise, is just that it's really important to see that that children missing education can actually be that really vital safeguarding warning of perhaps something that's going on at home or outside of the home. It can be one of those indicators of that. So that's the second expectation, and I'll hand back over to Adam.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. Let's have the next slide, please. Perfect. There's a specific webinar on our YouTube channel, and I know people are asking questions in the chat about whether this one will be on there. It will, so don't worry if you've missed part of it and you need to go back. It'll be on the YouTube channel. But there's a specific one on there about school attendance policies, the school's attendance policy. So I won't go into this in huge detail, but all schools are expected to have a clear attendance policy and published on their school website, so everybody in the school community can see it. It's not meant to be a dusty document, and the point of it isn't to write and have a fancy document, but it's an articulation of everything that you're doing on attendance. So everyone in the school community, from the head teacher to the caretaker to parents or a pupil themselves, are aware of what is expected of each other, and you're aware and understand how you will be working together to make things happen. The policy is expected to set a number of things out, and they set out in the guidance clearly as bullet points. The first is the attendance expectations and the punctuality expectations, so that pupils and parents know when they have to be at school. The second is the name and details of the school's senior attendance champion. The third is information and contact details for parents who want to report an absence, so a day-to-day reporting of absence, and details of who they need to contact if they've got a problem with their pupils' attendance and they want to access support from the school. We talk a lot about following up absences and inviting people in for meetings, but part of this is to encourage parents to take a bit of ownership in fulfilling their legal duty. So those details are really important for that. And then details of those day-to-day processes, so everybody in school knows what they're responsible for doing to monitor attendance, follow up absences, take cases forward. Details of how the school is promoting and incentivising good attendance and why it matters. An explanation of what your strategy looks like and how you're using data. So how are you using your data? What does your data tell you? And where will you be focusing based on that? And then crucially, how are you going to go about it? And finally, details of when penalty notices to improve, and the other legal interventions in the guidance will be used. And that policy should be regularly revisited and updated. It's no good having it on there for 3 and 4 years at a time. It needs to be a live articulation of what you're doing. Everybody should be aware of it in the school community, so regularly bring it to staff and parents' attention. The guidance expects that it's sent to parents when the pupil first joins the school, and then again at the beginning of each school year. But it's good, particularly at times like this of the year where people are thinking about taking holidays, to include it in newsletters or whatever, so that everybody is aware and clear of it. Back to you, Paul.
Great, thank you. And next slide, please. So hopefully, I think this is probably quite an obvious expectation, but all schools are required by law to have an admission register, and unless all your pupils are boarders, an attendance register. These registers, one change actually, so these registers must be kept electronically from the beginning of the next school year that's coming. So the new School Attendance Pupil Registration England Regulations 2024, which doesn't quite roll off the tongue, but they govern how those registers should be maintained from the next school year, and for example, when and why they can be amended. The details are also given in sections 7 and 8 of the updated guidance, and we've got a webinar basically on the registers on next Wednesday, so I'll avoid going into too much detail here. That will be an opportunity to really dig into those absence codes, for example, and some of the details around registers. But one change to flag, which is the third point on your list, is that from the next school year, registers will be required to be retained for 6 years rather than 3. And this is just to allow schools and Ofsted to look back over a pupil's whole time at the school to identify any patterns and to identify, for example, how they can support them. Moving on to the fourth point, So the regulations set out that leaves of absence should only be granted in specific circumstances. And schools do have the discretion to, within this, to grant a leave of absence for exceptional circumstances, taking into account the individual facts of a case. We wouldn't, as a department, we could never anticipate all the scenarios that might cover, and we wouldn't want to. But I think it is worth saying that the new guidance is clear that we wouldn't generally consider a need or a desire for holiday to be an exceptional circumstance in that regard. Moving on to the penultimate point. So the guidance sets out from paragraph 43, so on page 18, sets out how schools should aim to have really clear processes on how they track and follow up absence and poor punctuality. So for example, this includes setting out how long the register will remain open, which should be the same for every session and not longer than 30 minutes. And also setting out how parents should contact the school when their child is absent and how any unexplained absences will be followed up. And as part of this, moving on to the last point, this will include how the school will update parents on their child's attendance and absence in overall terms. And we recommend that this isn't just in headline terms, but is in a way that is easy for them to understand. So, for example, an overall figure of 90% actually sounds really good when you're used to hearing about exam results. But maybe if you explain that more in terms of the time that a pupil has missed or the impact that this will have on them, then actually the impact may be much more helpful in that regard. And I know there's some brilliant ways that schools already do this. There's plenty of best practice in the sector on how to do that. And Adam, I will hand over to you for expectation 5.
Perfect, thanks. Next slide, please. Great. So we've mentioned it a few times so far, haven't we? But data really is the lifeblood of attendance work. So good analysis, as so many of you know, good analysis of your register data allows you to focus in your efforts where you can have the biggest impact. It also allows you, obviously, to monitor the progress and what is actually happening as a result of that. And the crucial bit now, I suppose, as the data is getting better and more sophisticated, is spot patterns earlier so that you can act earlier. Data in itself sitting in a document doesn't do anything, but if you can spot those patterns and you can act earlier to prevent the pattern from absence from becoming entrenched to the point where it becomes persistent or severe, we can make a bigger impact on young people and their families. So the vast majority of schools are now sharing their data electronically with DfE. All state schools need to do so before the 19th of August when it becomes a legal requirement. So if you haven't yet, please do so. There is a webinar tomorrow which we'll give details of at the end for those of you who haven't and want to find out more information about that. But sharing your data gives access to the View My Education data system, which allows you to make comparisons to statistically similar schools and check your progress against them, benchmark against them. It also allows you to analyse absence. A new functionality that came out last week is it allows you to analyse absence data in 5% bandings, so 95 to 100, 90 to 95, etc. And one of the things that that's allowed schools to do is to look at who's sitting just above and just below the persistent absence threshold, which across the country equates to about 35% of all absence. And knowing which pupils they are who are in that category really speaks to that earlier point I made, I suppose, about being able to act earlier. So if we know who those people are, and you can prioritise some of your attention there, the problems are very similar. In many of these cases, but it means that you can act upon them before they become entrenched, and they're easier, hopefully, in some of those cases at that point. I won't go into all the detail on data and what sort of is expected, but paragraphs 45 to 47 of the guidance set it out in detail what that looks like, and there is a webinar on the YouTube channel about how to make effective use of your data to develop your school strategy. You can find that on there, and as I said, there is a session tomorrow specifically about use of the View Your Education data system and signing up for that live data sharing. Back to you, Paul.
Great, thank you. So next slide, please. And this brings us to the penultimate expectation for schools, and this is a really key part of working together to improve attendance. I guess the clue's in the name, but the idea of sharing information and working collaboratively with other schools in your area, with the local authority and other partners, particularly when absence is at risk of becoming persistent or severe. And I think when people hear the phrase other partners, the things that perhaps spring to mind are police and health bodies, and they definitely come under that. But I think it's also worth adding that some schools have really benefited from investing in links with other organisations, for instance, with organisations in the voluntary and community sector, with youth services, for example. In terms of sharing with schools, so I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that actually many of the answers to attendance issues are within the sector already. So actually schools can really help each other out by working together to share that best practice, to show what worked for them and maybe what they tried and didn't work as well. And some schools can do this by attendance hubs, but actually for all schools, there's an expectation, depending on your setting, but either if you're in a multi-academy trust, there's an expectation for trusts, but there's also an expectation for local authorities in the guidance that they will provide opportunities for schools in their area to come together and to share best practice and to talk about issues in this way. And this can be a really good way of building those links, can be particularly useful, for example, for establishing links between feeder schools, and also perhaps for looking to support families who have children in more than one school in an area. The second and third items on the screen relate to data sharing, but actually there is a little difference between them. So on the second point, all schools, including independent schools, are required to make certain returns to your local authority. We've listed these on page 21 of the updated guidance, but they relate, for example, to new pupils and deletions, to continuous periods of unauthorised absence, and to periods where the pupil is likely to miss 15 days because of sickness. The reasons for these are to allow the school and local authority to fulfil their statutory duty to pupils and to work together to put any relevant support in place. And outside of those key things that I mentioned, local authorities can also request data at other times when it's essential in fulfilling their duties, although they're expected to keep the burden to a minimum, which brings us on to the third point in the list. So we said at the beginning that new regulations will mean all state-funded schools will be required to share their daily attendance data. And there are links in the guidance for the easiest way to do this. And I know other things have been shared more widely. I think there's potentially some things in the chat as well. But actually, by sharing daily attendance data, this will actually really reduce the need for any further requests from the local authority. So we hope actually that will reduce the burden for both the school and the local authority in terms of those additional requests. The final point on the slide, I think I already mentioned at the start when I discussed the overall changes, but essentially we've added that requirement to inform not just the social worker, but also if you know the child as a youth offending team worker, then to inform them of any unexplained absences so they can take any action as appropriate. Adam, back over to you.
Perfect, thanks, Paul. Next slide, please. Perfect. The final section then is expectations of what should be done where pupils who need additional support due to mental health or physical ill health or special educational needs and disabilities. I know this is a challenging area for many schools. The first thing here to note, I suppose, is that many children experience those normal but difficult emotions, particularly on the mental health side, that make them nervous about attending school. And those pupils, like all pupils, are still expected to attend school regularly, and in many instances that can actually help with supporting the underlying issue. When a case is more complex, as for so many of our young people it is, for example, pupils who have a long-term physical or mental health condition, or they've got a special educational need and or disability, the usual support processes for any attendance case apply, really. So as I said right at the beginning, working with the pupil and family to understand the needs in that specific case, putting the right in-school support in place for that specific case, and working with any other external agencies that are necessary to provide the help that family needs to get their child into school. School staff aren't expected to diagnose or treat medical conditions, but they are expected to work alongside and support families to ensure as much attendance as possible. All pupils have that right to a full-time education, and that's an education suitable to any special educational need they have. So it's our responsibility collectively to make sure that they get as much of that as possible. So paragraph 57 in the guidance sets out the expectations for these pupils for where there are mental and physical long-term health conditions, and paragraph 58 sets out specifics for those with special educational needs and or disabilities. At the end of this section of the guidance, paragraph 64 to 69 cover part-time timetables, and part-time or reduced timetables can be used in very exceptional circumstances where it's in the pupil's best interests. We're always balancing this tension of their right to as much of a full-time education as they can receive with the need for temporary reintegration and support, and those pupils who full-time isn't attainable for. They should have, if you're going for a part-time timetable, they should have the agreement of both the school and the parent, and that's the parent that the pupil normally lives with, in line with other leaves of absence. They should have a clear ambition, and they should be part of a wider plan to support that pupil, whether that's a sort of pastoral plan, a healthcare plan, a reintegration plan, an attendance plan. And they should have regular review dates where the pupil comes along if they're old enough, pupil and parent if not, and they can be supported to consider whether the timetable is working, so that they're only in place for the shortest time necessary. All of the part-time timetables should have a proposed end date when the pupil is expected to be back in school full-time or back into or into for the first time, alternative provision all of the time. Of course, that can be reviewed and it can be extended if necessary, but there should always be a clear ambition of where it's headed to. And I suppose really that's a whistle-stop tour of the expectations of schools. There's lots and lots of content there, but there are lots of webinars planned this term on various elements of the guidance. There's lots of them on the YouTube channel that we've done in the past. If there's specific sections from what Paul and I have said that you want to go and look at in greater detail. Before we move on to questions, could we have the next slide, please? Yeah, before we go on to questions, let's just pause a little bit on the role of the local authority and what you as a school can expect from local authorities, as in chapter 4 of the guidance. Next slide, please. Perfect. So, as I say, chapter 4 of the guidance sets out the roles and expectations of the local authority. As many of you know, since 2022, many LAs have been on a journey to get there and to prepare to deliver that service. They all started from different starting points, which was part of the reason in the Schools White Paper in 2022 that the guidance was suggested, so that everybody has clear roles and responsibilities. But from the beginning of the new school year, after the 19th of August, like for schools, these expectations of local authorities will be statutory. So you can expect the following things from your local authority. You can expect the local authority to provide you with a named contact in their attendance support team. That isn't to take on all of your attendance responsibility or to do all of the casework, but it is to provide advice and guidance when that's needed on a case, and it is to be a link point between you and other services where that's necessary. You can expect them to hold a regular targeting support meeting with you. What that isn't is the LA coming in and holding a school to account. That's a meeting of two equal partners where you both sat around the table and thinking about where can we agree actions that the local authority can provide help and support with for pupils who have those out of school barriers, and for the local authority to provide advice on some of the cases that you perhaps are struggling with a little bit internally and things that you might not have thought about. I've sat in on about a dozen of them so far this school year in all different parts of the country, and it's really great to see actually that meeting of professional minds and sort of people helping one another to unblock things with things that they hadn't necessarily thought before. All schools are expected to take part in those meetings, and I know many areas of the country are already having them. If they haven't started in your area yet, they're in train to be developed, and please do take up that opportunity when it comes. Your local authority will also provide regular opportunities for you and other schools in the area to come together to share effective practice. Sometimes that's newsletters, online drop-in sessions, termly conference or yearly conference. All different parts of the country are treating that differently, but a really good opportunity for you to get different perspectives on how other people are facing the problem and tackling the problem. And then you can expect the local authority to work alongside you to provide support for pupils when they're persistently and severely absent, where those barriers, as I said before, are outside of school and aren't things that you can do. They can't and won't always take the lead in those cases. The majority of cases will continue to sit with you at the school, but they will help provide access to services that they have access to. They can help you with assessments, and in cases where the local authority or a local authority team is best placed to lead, they will be able to do that too. And of course, local authorities will continue to take forward attendance legal intervention in line with that section of the guidance. That includes administering the local code of conduct for penalty notices as part of the national framework, but it also includes things like education supervision orders and ultimately, of course, prosecution. Perfect. Should we take some questions, Paul?
Yes, excellent. So I've got a list of your questions. Please do bear with us as we do this, because we've received a lot of questions, which is brilliant. We'll try to group them together. We'll try to answer the main themes, but there may be some that we can't get to just for reasons of time, etc. But so Adam, I will start. We've had quite a few questions around independent schools, so I might try to group them together, but questions around whether the guidance applies to independent schools or in what way. Also, particularly, I think in terms of with regard to legal action as a last resort.
Yeah.
So whether some of those measures are available to independent schools, and also a question specifically around independent special schools. Are you able to say a bit more on that?
Yeah, okay. So on independent schools, we're working with the Independent Schools Council and the Independent Schools Association on a fact sheet that sets out everything as clearly as we can for specific schools, and we'll make sure people have access to that. But in terms of a high-level rule of thumb, everything in the guidance applies to all types of school, including independent schools, unless it specifically otherwise says not. So the same expectations apply of independent schools that we've talked through this afternoon, and as set out in chapter 2 of the guidance. Independent schools can expect the same support from the local authority in line with chapter 4. Those 4 core expectations we've talked through and that are up there on the screen. There's flexibility in how local authorities provide that to independent schools, recognising that there is a vast range of different types of independent schools. So it may not look exactly the same as it does for your peers in state-funded schools, but you can expect those core 4 offers. On legal intervention, penalty notices can't be used for pupils who are registered in an independent school, but that doesn't mean that attendance prosecution can't be taken forward. A parent is still committing the offence or potentially committing the offence of failing to secure their child's regular attendance in the same way. So local authorities can and will take forward legal action for pupils, for parents of pupils in independent schools, but the penalty notice isn't an option. The only other thing that can't be used by independent schools is a formal attendance or parenting contract. The legislation doesn't allow for that from the 2003 Antisocial Behaviour Act, but it doesn't mean that's a specific thing that governing bodies of schools can use and local authorities can use. But that doesn't mean you can't replicate what is in it. It just won't fit that specific legal tool. But there's no reason you can't have an attendance support plan that does exactly the same thing, setting out this is the problem, this is what we as a school are going to do, this is what you as a parent are going to do, this is what you as a pupil are going to do if you're old enough, this is what you as a local authority are going to do to help you, and we want to see this level of improvement by this time, and we're going to review them at this date. You can have a document that does that, but it can't be a formal attendance contract in the same way.
And actually that brings us nicely into one of the other questions, which was when school uses attendance agreements, and there's a question around whether that's still allowed or whether they need to be changed to attendance contracts in line with the change from parenting contracts.
Yeah, so There's very little difference between a parenting contract and an attendance contract. It is just a rebranding, as Paul mentioned at the beginning. So if you meet the conditions that are set out in the guidance on what goes into an attendance contract or a parenting contract, then it is a parenting contract for the purposes of the Antisocial Behaviour Act.
Sorry, I presented, but so if they're using, a school is using the phrase attendance agreement, is that fine in the same? Yeah.
If it meets the conditions of a parenting contract, then it's a parenting contract. If you just want to have a slightly less formal tool of a sort of attendance action plan, attendance support plan, there's no reason you can't have any of those. But if it meets the definition of being a parenting contract, then it's a parenting contract. And it, we call it attendance contract for the purposes of school attendance, and you could call that attendance agreement or what have you. But best to stick to things that are in the guidance if you are going to do a proper contract, because then everybody's clear. Local authority will know what you're talking about. Parents are clear if they look at the guidance, etc. But if you want a slightly less formal tool in the voluntary section of support, then an attendance agreement, attendance support plan can do lots of the same things, but without the sort of legal constraints of that particular tool.
Thank you. We've got a question around the duty to inform the local authority where a pupil has or is expected to have 15 days of illness, and whether that is 15 consecutive days or non-consecutive. The guidance does say that it is at both and or, so it is both consecutive or cumulative, and I think would suggest that schools talk to the local authority to look at how they best want to be informed of that.
The local authority will set out for you how they want to receive that information. The purpose of that is to make sure that you're both aware of the cases where Section 19, exceptional provision of education, may be necessary. It doesn't mean that in every time that threshold is met that you're going to need something to do something specific yourselves or require something specifically from the local authority, but it allows both parties to be aware that that duty may have been enacted. So there are three things you're thinking about when you're looking at that sickness return, as it's called in the guidance. The first is, has this child had 15 days of sickness absence, illness absence, either consecutive or cumulative, as we've talked about. Depending on whether it's consecutive or cumulative, it will obviously change whether something is needed in many of those cases, but it allows the conversation to happen. The other crucial thing, the third thing, is to make sure that if you are made aware that a child is going to miss this time, the duty also kicks in to inform the local authority. So, for example, if you're told that a child has received a diagnosis for something, that means they're likely to need inpatient healthcare every Thursday of the school year, then you make your sickness return to the local authority now. You don't wait until 15 of those Thursdays have passed, so that you can discuss and agree whether something needs to be put in place for continuity of education on those days.
Brilliant, thank you. Just looking for another question. This is a question around school policies. So one school that says they have a trust policy that each school links to, and each school then adds in their contact details on their own attendance page. Is that still okay to do, or do they need to have a policy for each school separately?
So it's fine to have that. I always caution against local authorities or anybody having a model policy, because, as I said when we talked about this earlier on, the idea is it's an articulation of what you as a school are doing, but it's fine as a trust to have, or a local authority to have, a policy that school then adds in those specifics that we talked about, that they add in where they focus in, what their processes look like, who you need to contact, etc. But yeah, try not to copy and paste policies, because it is supposed to be an articulation of what you're doing. But you could start with the template like that, and as this person, sorry, I didn't catch the name, as the person is suggesting, add in the detail specific for your school.
Excellent, thank you. We've got a couple of questions around the senior attendance champion, so that role on the senior leadership team. So both a question around whether that's different to the attendance lead, and also a question around whether it is a statutory requirement to have a senior champion to have an attendance champion on the senior leadership team.
Yeah, I suspect we talk about the same thing when we talk about the senior attendance champion and the attendance lead. There's a statutory expectation from the beginning of next school year that every school has a senior attendance champion or attendance lead on their school's leadership team. So somebody who's responsible for overseeing attendance in school. That doesn't mean they do all of the attendance thing. Attendance is everyone's business. And we ran last week a webinar that's available on YouTube where we looked at what that role looks like. It doesn't mean you do everything, but that person's a sort of figurehead of attendance in the school, making sure that those processes are in place, that everybody knows what they're expected to do, making sure that attendance is talked about at leadership and governor level, tracking and monitoring whether it is improving across the school.
Excellent, thank you. I think actually 2 questions related to health, so physical and mental health. I'll do them one at a time, but one on part-time timetables. So just a request for perhaps a bit more information on how long a part-time timetable can be considered for a pupil. So the previous version of the guidance said it should be reviewed at least every 6 weeks. Does that still hold, or is there any further guidance on how long it can be in place?
So it doesn't give a specific, because the ethos of the guidance is thinking about the individual case and what is appropriate in that individual case. So for some people, a 3-week part-time timetable is sufficient to help recover from coming out of hospital, all the way through to so perhaps a pupil who's had a baby and for a prolonged period may be able to take part in a couple of sessions a week after that baby's been born, and everywhere in between. So there is no specifics, but regularly reviewed is in there, and I think you're not wrong to think that half-termly 6 weekly is a sort of minimum really to do that. But just checking in and seeing whether the conditions and the things that were in place, the context is still right, whether more could be done, or conditions worse and slightly less might be able to be provided. So it is keeping that live with all of the partners involved.
And so I guess the second question connected to health, particularly mental health, is whether there's anything we can say about the role of medical evidence, particularly, I'm trying to find the question now, but particularly around what role medical evidence plays where people has mental health issues which affect their attendance.
Yeah, so there are 2 things for medical evidence, aren't there? There's a first set of medical evidence when you think about how you're recording the absence and whether an absence is recorded as illness or not. The sort of rule of thumb there is in the pupil registration regulations that govern the keeping of the register. You have to choose the most appropriate attendance code for that case, and in the vast majority of cases, if a parent is clear that the pupil is too unwell to be in school, then that will be recorded as sickness. If you have genuine doubt in that individual case that isn't the case, then you can talk to the family about medical evidence. It's difficult to request some of the things that schools try to request sometimes. So if the parent hasn't yet got a diagnosis, that doesn't necessarily mean that child isn't ill. What medical evidence have they got? Can we have a conversation about it? Can we look at when they might need to be off? And equally, parents who go to the GP and come back with a letter that says this child is ill, that doesn't mean they can't be in school any of the time. So it's good to have a conversation about it if you're worried about it. But so there's medical evidence about authorising absence. The general rule of thumb is to trust parents. If you've got genuine doubt, look at what they can provide, have a conversation, etc. The second set of medical evidence, and actually more important, is understanding what sort of provision, if it's a long-term health condition, the child can access when they can be in school. How can we support them? So it's good to try and move the conversation onto that so that parents are clear what they've been asked to provide evidence for, really, and that stops some of the breakdown in relationship on this vexed question about how the absence is recorded. There's sections in the guidance under Code I in Chapter 8 on that, and there's a section under this in Chapter 2 under the support for pupils with long-term medical conditions that talk specifically about. So if you want more further information, that's in there.
Excellent, thank you very much. There's a really helpful question here about what we would envisage a joint approach with the local authority looking like for their severely absent pupils. So I guess we'd expect those regular targeting support meetings, so the local authority and school to be meeting to discuss that severely absent cohort, to discuss how they could support them. And obviously the approach will vary for each pupil, But are there any general things that you think might happen, or how responsibilities might be shared?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? And again, it's slightly unhelpful answer because it doesn't answer the question directly. But coming back to this ethos of individual needs of that individual family in that individual case, as a rule of thumb, as I mentioned, in-school barriers are things where the school will be holding the case and supporting with. Where there are out-of-school barriers, it will be a joint case between the school and local authority. So if transport is part of the issue or housing is part of the issue where a local authority team is engaged, then you'd be working together. And where a case becomes really severe and you need a local authority team involved, so like the ones we were just talking about medical evidence, for example, where if a child was going to miss every Friday and you've agreed with the local authority that actually we do need to put some sort of formal medical support plan in place, or an EHCP, or an early help plan, then obviously the local authority are leading in that case and school are supporting. So there are different cases for different types, but the ethos of the guidance is that we stop seeing local authority over there and school over there, and we start seeing those working together. As I mentioned, local authorities in many parts of the country are on a journey to be able to get there. Their service has changed hugely over the 10 years, and we're starting to see people moving back to working in that way. But it isn't there overnight for everybody. But hopefully you're starting to see the network meetings or opportunities to share best practice. You will start to see the targeted support meetings, and you will have your points of contact. So if you're in doubt in a case, you talk to the local authority. But please don't go away from here thinking the local authority can take every case from you. They can't. They're not resourced and able to do that. But they will work with you wherever they can on those cases.
And that's really that last bit as well is really helpful. I think there's perhaps one or two questions just about that, where that that kind of joint working isn't quite there yet between the school and local authority, or maybe some of it's there, but not quite everything in the guidance. And I think what you've said is really helpful, just in terms of both schools and local authorities are kind of adjusting to these new this new guidance and kind of as we lead up to the next school year. Excellent. So I know there's a seminar next week on the register and the attendance and admission registers. So we don't have time to go into too many questions on that, but there have just been a couple of people who've asked whether the H code will continue to exist from the next school year. Is there anything we can say on that?
So the H code's been retired from the new code set. So from the beginning of next school year, you won't have H code. There's still G code for unauthorised holidays. As Paul mentioned earlier on, the guidance, the new version of the guidance is clearer on holidays, making clear, ministers took a very clear position that a need or desire for a period of recreation or leisure isn't generally considered an exceptional circumstance. So they've taken away that. We've taken away that specific code. If in exceptional circumstances you need to grant a leave of absence that includes holiday for part of that, for any exceptional reason, the guidance says generally, so there may be the odd case where that is necessary, then it's recorded under C code and the rest of just the same as another exceptional leave of absence.
Excellent, thank you. We've had, I'm just trying to find them now, apologies. There's been a lot of questions, which is great, but just a couple of questions around the fixed penalty notice framework and what that will look like in terms of the next school year. I think so. There is a webinar in around 2 weeks' time, isn't there? Which there should be a link in the slides, which I think will be really helpful in terms of talking through what that looks like. I think, is there any? I guess local authorities would be expecting them to be working with schools on their code of practice for how they're going to implement the new network ahead of the next school year. So I think probably it's a case of speak to a local authority and ask them what they're planning. Is there anything more you'd like to say on that?
So on the national framework, all the details are set out in the Working Together to Improve School Attendance guidance. Talk to your local authority about how it's going to operate in your area. Many of them are running sessions or giving updates to people and fact sheets to schools in their area to know how to follow them. The other crucial thing is the framework will only work if we get the message across the families. So we're doing some of that nationally. Local authorities are doing some of that, but please do include the details in your newsletters or communications to parents so that people are aware. The fine increase cut through very clearly in the media. They love that type of story, don't they? And it cut through very clearly on television and newspapers. I think what has been less clear is the escalation. So a second penalty notice being charged at a higher amount and a parent only being able to receive 2 in a 3-year period to prevent repeat offending, with that third one considering prosecution on other activity at that point. I don't think that has cut through as much to parents yet, so there is something that schools can do there to help us to get that message across to parents, particularly where there have been patterns of repeat offending in the past. Perfect.
I think that's us. So there's one final question which I can answer here and now, but just for clarity, somebody's asked whether non-maintained schools will be working with their local authority going forward on attendance as well.
Yes.
And the answer is yes, I think. So I will, for clarity, I'll hand over.
Schools shouldn't be treated differently depending on the school type. Chapter 4 is clear on that. The only slight caveat to that I mentioned earlier is independent schools, where the same 4 things can be expected, the same core service offer expected free of charge from the LA, but it can be delivered in a slightly different way to meet the needs of some of those schools which have a very different context, size, makeup, etc. Perfect. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time this afternoon and for being with us. Could we have the next slide, Emma? We are enormously grateful, and I know ministers are enormously grateful for everything everyone continues to do. If we didn't get a chance to answer your question this afternoon, apologies. We will try and pick up as many of these questions through the future webinar series as we can in the topics on those specific areas. The next one, as I mentioned, is tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and that is specifically for information on how to share data with DfE via the One system for state-funded schools, and also how to access that information in the View My Education data system. So questions on that, please sign up for that tomorrow. It's in the calendar of invitation team, isn't it? Where do people go to sign up for it? Can we get a link for people? That might be easier.
Yes, so there was a link right at the beginning of the chat, but I appreciate there's been a lot of questions. So I think we'll aim to put something in the chat as well at the bottom so you can see the calendar of activity.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening, everybody, and thank you. Bye.